what we have here is an example of a city budget. And I wanted to illustrate this to you to show you all how funds tie together, as well as to kind of give you all a visual illustration of how a budget would actually look on paper. So in this example, we have a city, and this city has several different funds. We have a general fund, we have a water fund, a gas fund, and of course a solid waste fund. And we have operating revenues. Okay, and our funds fall under the revenues as well as our funds fall under the expenses category. We also have debt service, capital outlay for our capital projects, and other indirect costs for other types of things. Then we have transfers, we have a deficiencies line item, we have water reserve, gas reserve, solid waste reserve, um, and of course we have our budget summary. Okay. Uh, Now, not all budgets are set up like this. You might not have all these line items. You may just have just straight funds, if you will. But in this example right here, I have a few things in here that was based on another city that I actually used to work with a while back. So anyway, just kind of jumping into this. So looking at our summary here, we have our actual FY16. Okay, our estimated data for 2017 is estimate because we're still in the fiscal years, right? So we don't know exactly what we've expended. So we won't know that until the fiscal year is over, and then of course we have what we're requesting for the next fiscal year, and then the next 4 years are basically forecast years, what we're forecasting for over the next 4 years for our budget. Okay, and outside of the current 3 years, right, you can see that the forecast years actually have a surplus forecasted for those, but that will be changed because if this city operates like other cities in other states, then it has to have a balanced budget. And a balanced budget basically means that you have a net zero here, and that net zero is because the revenues and the expenses match, right? If you subtract the expenses from the revenues, you get zero. Okay, in the prior year, the revenues and expenditures they match. The revenues and expenditures match. That is what we call a balanced budget, right? We don't have a surplus having more revenues, and we don't have a deficit having more expenses. Now let's go and look at general fund expenditures. Now here is a summarization of the general fund. Now this is just a summary of every department that resides within this general fund. Okay, so this would include, say, police, public works, uh, uh, neighborhood services, economic development. Every department that within this city that would be considered a general fund department would be factored into these numbers here. So these salaries include every employee within that works within a department within the general fund. Okay, so here I see that we have for fiscal year 2018, 59 million dollars budgeted for salaries, and then our total general fund expenditure amount comes to $90 million. Okay, and I see I have a $1 here, $1 surplus, and that's just attributed to rounding somewhere in this number, and we'll deal with that later. Um, and likewise for the budget year, uh, or rather the estimated year. Let's change that to estimated year. For 2017, we had $85 million. Okay. Now let's go look at our revenues. Our revenues for the general fund. Okay. Now, if you think back to the first discussion and the first readings in this course, we talked about the differences between private sector budgeting and finance and public sector budgeting and finance. Okay. And one of the main differences between these two types of financial practices, if you will, is that you can't tie revenues to expenses within government, especially in the general fund. So if you look here at salaries, wages, other line items, right? They don't tie back to the revenues because these revenues include fees, property taxes, other taxes, parking fines, recreation fees, animal shelter, etc. Right? So there's virtually no way to tie back dollar for dollar every piece of revenue back to expenditures. Okay, that's because within a general fund, especially, the money just kind of goes into one big pot of money and gets divided up among general fund departments and for general fund type things. Okay. Now, if you look at the revenue, another revenue line item, or three more line items down here, we have transfers from other funds. So we have transfer from your water utility, transfer from gas, and a transfer from solid waste. Okay. So now let's go look at the water utility fund and see what that one is doing. The water utility fund here, I have the revenues and expenditures on the same sheet because it's a small fund. Okay. And by small, I mean it doesn't have that many line items. Um, Looking at their revenues, they have selling water to residents, selling water to businesses. They have other surcharges, and then we have tapping fees. Tapping fees refers to the installation of water taps, like so that you can actually turn your water on. So every time a house or a building is constructed within the city limits, and that's generally in the city, the water utility department will charge you a tapping fee to give you access to their water. Okay. Um, Looking at expenses here, we have, of course, personnel, operating, capital outlay, utilities, debt service, and then look, we have transfer to general fund. Okay. Now, if we go back and look at the general fund dollar amount for 2017 as well as 16 and 18, they should be the same. So let's go and see. Let's go to revenues and look at the 2000 fund water amount, water utility transfer, and look, it's the same. Okay, so that's good. That's a good thing. The the outgoing money in the water fund is incoming money in the general fund. Okay, and the same thing with gas. Gas is set up just like water. We have our revenues and we have our expenditures, and again, they all balance, right? If you look at the revenues, the revenue total and the expenditure total, it balances. The same thing with the solid waste fund. The revenues and the expenditures match. And again, of course, we have our transfer to the general fund. Now, also, we have another transfer for our funds. We have a transfer to solid waste reserves, a transfer to gas reserve for the gas fund, and a transfer to the water reserve for the water fund. Generally, every fund will have some type of reserve account so that they can have money set aside for a rainy day, right? Or in case they need to build new things, or in the event an emergency takes place, they will have access to additional revenue. So that's why they kind of save money. So generally, it's not a good thing for governments to generate additional revenue, right, beyond their expenses. At the end of the day, governments should balance. The revenue should match their expenses. But in reality, it's virtually impossible to predict dollar for dollar revenues against expenses. So what do governments do in the event that they have a surplus? Well, they put it into a reserve account. Okay, and then they plug that reserve account into an expense line item. So now whatever uh, surplus this fund had, it just basically put all that surplus into a reserve. And you can justify that to the citizens or to your taxpayers because at the end of the day, you can make the case that, what, we need to have money set aside for a rainy day. We don't want to get caught, without enough money to do something in the event an emergency comes up. So, and most taxpayers will buy that. And generally, that's what the governments do with that money. They don't just hoard money to be hoarding it, but they oftentimes will keep reserves for emergency and for a rainy day and those types of things. So now going back to the summarization here, right? We can see our transfers, right? All those numbers tie back to our individual spreadsheets. Okay, and this spreadsheet is available on Web Campus in case you're interested in looking at it. And all the numbers do tie back. And so the reserves and the transfers, they all match the reserves and transfers within each department. Okay. And so at the end of the day, when we look at the summarization of our city, this city has a budget of $177 million for revenues and for expenses, and it balances.